listening to the Sustainable Angler and my daddy's the host.
All right, special thanks to my sweetheart for the introduction, and welcome to the Sustainable Angler, the podcast where we discuss the intersection of fishing and sustainability and how we can all contribute to protecting what we love. I'm your host, Rick Crawford. In this episode, we dive into the world of bass fishing with the Bass Angler Sportsman Society, also known as B.A.S.S, the largest fishing organization in the world with over 500,000 members. Founded in 1968 by Ray Scott, B.A.S.S has been the driving force behind professional bass fishing, youth involvement, and conservation efforts. I sit down with Gene Gilliland, who is the National Conservation Director at B.A.S.S, to explore key challenges in bass fisheries management, from invasive species and aquatic plant control to the impact of climate change on bass populations. We discuss the balance between recreational use and habitat preservation, the evolving role of catch and release fishing, and the need for selective harvesting to maintain healthy bass populations. We also highlight other conservation initiatives, habitat restoration and aging reservoirs, and the importance of angler involvement in protecting our waters. Be sure to check out our website, thesustainableangler.com. And if you enjoy the podcast, an absolutely free way to show your support is by leaving it a 5-star rating and review on Apple Podcast or Spotify. The Sustainable Angler is available anywhere you listen to podcasts and is also airing Saturdays at 2 p.m. on Charleston's first and only community-supported radio station, Home Radio, 96.3 FM. This episode of The Sustainable Angler is brought to you by Emerger Strategies and a New Earth Project, the sustainability initiative of Atlantic Packaging.
We set out with a New Earth Project to really start a movement.
It's a global coalition of people who are deeply concerned and want to accelerate the transition away from problematic packaging to more sustainable solutions.
Our entire value proposition was built on helping companies package things better. We were doing sustainability before sustainability was cool. We just called it packaging optimization. And packaging optimization really is about using less. And we built our whole business on that. You know, people send us their products, their goods, and we help them design packaging systems and solutions for the least possible cost, utilizing the least amount of material. Use less is always the right answer.
And that's what I see with companies like a New Earth Project is it's like we're just trying to create solutions for big companies and small, that makes it easier for them, cheaper for them, whatever it is, and then has less impact. Not just trying to tell people you should have less impact and making the choice forced on them. Like, make it better for everybody, and it'll make it better for the whole world.
We see the problem, and we are with you.
Did you know that sustainability isn't just the right thing to do, it's smart business? At Emerger Strategies, we simplify sustainability for small and medium-sized businesses, helping you meet retailer demands, build customer loyalty, and protect the planet. Whether you're navigating retailer sustainability assessments, tackling EPR for packaging requirements, or measuring your carbon footprint, we help you measure and improve your brand's sustainability performance. Our clients in the fishing and outdoor industries are thriving, saving time and money, and growing their businesses, all while reducing their environmental footprint. We've been simplifying sustainable business since 2016, empowering brands like yours to make a real impact without the need to hire, train, and retain a full-time sustainability team. Ready to make sustainability your competitive advantage? Visit emergerstrategies.com to learn how we can help your business profit sustainably.
Well, Bass Angler Sportsman Society, we just call it BASS for short, is the largest fishing organization in the world. BASS has over 500,000 members across the globe, most of them obviously here in the United States, but we do have members in, I believe, 11 different foreign countries. So it was started by a guy named Ray Scott back in 1968, who was an avid bass angler, and he kind of had the dream of creating an organization that united bass fishermen all over the country. And he started with had a magazine called Bassmaster Magazine, which is the largest circulation fishing publication in the world now. And he started bass tournaments. Because bass tournaments have been going on for a number of years before, but what Ray did was to sort of put them up on a national stage and created what has become, professional bass fishing. But along the way, some of the tenets of his organization, besides the fishing competition, the how to and where to, type information, he wanted to get kids, youth involved in fishing, because he saw that certainly as the future. And his third component was conservation, because he understood that without clean water and healthy fish populations, he didn't have a business. And so that became he liked to call it a three-legged stool. The fishing is one leg of the stool, youth is the other, and conservation is the third leg. And you have to have all three legs for the stool to stand up.
Yep.
So he put a lot of emphasis on conservation programs over the years. He eventually, he did a lot of it himself early on. He sued people for polluting. He organized marches and protests and stuff against some outlandish fishing regulations that some states were trying to propose. And so but eventually he hired a conservation director. This would have been probably in the early 90s, and kind of formalized the program at that point under the conservation banner that Bass has. I am the fourth conservation director to have worked for Bass. And my predecessors, some of them came from the first one worked for the U.S. Forest Service prior to his coming to Bass. The next one was a former fisheries chief for the New York Department of Conservation. Another one was, I guess that was 5. There was another one that was, he was a black bass biologist for the state of Arkansas for a while. And then my immediate predecessor was the late Noreen Plow, who was a career administrator for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And eventually she rose to become the assistant or deputy director for fisheries programs in Washington, D.C. When she retired, she took a position with Bass for a few years. I came along after a 32-year career with the Oklahoma Department of Wildlife Conservation. I was a fishery research biologist, did a lot of work with black bass, bass tournaments, with Florida bass introductions, just a whole litany of bass-related research. And I eventually, unfortunately, I guess you'd say, moved up the ladder to administration and became the assistant chief of fisheries. And after 3 years of that, I decided it was time to retire. And it was just about the same time that Noreen was ready to leave her position as conservation director at Bass, so the timing was just right. That was 11 years ago. So I've been with B.A.S.S. now for 11 years.
Wow.
My job as conservation director really has 3 components. I work with the state fish and wildlife agencies. I work on a number of boards and councils at the federal level and the national level that deal with fisheries policy and administration. I also work with internally within the company with our tournament staff, making sure that we're doing everything we can to keep our fish healthy and our procedures and our weigh-ins as what I call fish friendly as possible. And the third component of my job is working with our state chapters. We have every state has a B.A.S. affiliate called the Bass Nation. And each of those state Bass Nation chapters has a state conservation director who is just a bass angler who has a little more passion for the resource and the conservation side of things. And I work with them on a lot of state and local conservation issues, especially as they relate to things like water quality and certainly as they relate to bass fishery management and bass fishing.
Wow. Well, thank you for that rundown and for your clear passion for fisheries and bass fishing, dedicating your career to our fisheries. So so thank you. But
Thank you.
I'm curious to know, Gene, what are I guess some states may have different conservation issues, but it is kind of a high level overview. What are some of the conservation and environmental challenges that bass fisheries face today?
There are obviously different things in different parts of the country, but there's a couple of common themes. One of them is the threat of invasive species. In different parts of the country, it's different plants or different critters that are the invaders. And so it's hard to say exactly, there's not one type of plant or one animal or something that's a problem everywhere. But most states have some sort of issues somewhere with invasive species, and that poses a number of different kinds of threats because invasive species can take the form of, say, aquatic plants that can alter habitat drastically, or invasive mussels like zebra mussels that can alter water quality very drastically, or things like disease organisms that can be invasive and certainly detrimental to fish populations. So just depending on what the state is and what the threats are, but when you look at it from a 30,000 foot level, invasive species are one of our biggest challenges, I think, going forward. And unfortunately, the ability to prevent is a big challenge. It costs a lot of money to do things the way they should be. The coordination among states is not always the best it could be. Obviously, you have federal issues, in waters that cross state lines, rivers and lakes and that sort of thing. So that's one of our bigger challenges is trying to get everybody on the same page and working on the same goals, and then finding the funding to be able to manage some of these things. And, they always say that prevention is cheaper than the cure. And that certainly is the case with invasive species, that we want to try to prevent infestations because it's much cheaper to keep them out than it is to try to figure out how to fix things once the invaders are in a body of water. And unfortunately, in some cases, once they're in a body of water, they're almost impossible to eradicate. And certainly we've seen in a lot of places around the country some pretty drastic changes in the ecology of our lakes and rivers and streams. And what that's done to the fisheries in those bodies of water. So another big challenge that we have from a more closely related to bass fishing is aquatic plant management. Kind of ties in a little bit to the invasive species things because in some cases the aquatic plants that are being managed are then in fact considered invasive species. And it's different plants in different parts of the country, and different states have different rules and regulations about how they have to be managed. But that word managed is what really is kind of the key to this, because in bass fishing circles, having aquatic plants at some level is usually considered a good thing. But unfortunately, a lot of the lakes and rivers and reservoirs where a lot of the bass fishing goes on, the other users of those bodies of water don't like the plants for one reason or another. And so the agencies or organizations that are tasked with protecting those waters, a lot of times, rather than managing at some controlled level, they tend to go the extreme to eradication. And a lot of times when that happens, the fishing quality suffers, because when you remove that much habitat, like with any kind of animals, any kind of birds or deer or turkeys or fish, when the habitat is declining, the populations decline. So that's a constant battle in a lot of places to try to find a balance between all of the different users that want to use those bodies of water and what is an acceptable level of aquatic plant growth to maintain healthy fisheries, but also not impede or create problems for the other users. Because there's, we got to admit that there's people that want to water ski and they want to swim, they want to boat. Those lakes are used sometimes for water supply, for hydropower, for irrigation. There's lots of different uses for our waters, and fishing is just one of them. So, in all of these cases, whether it's any of these threats to bass fishing, the big key that we try to encourage all of our members, my state conservation directors, people that want to become advocates for the sport of bass fishing, is that we have to have a seat at the table when decisions are being made about the management of those lakes and rivers and reservoirs, so that the bass fishing interests are considered as part of the plan for the use of all of those lakes and all those waters.
Yeah, it seems a couple of things is I used to live in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and one summer I worked for Wyoming Game and Fish, and I was an aquatic invasive species technician. And we were the first group to do it there. And so we were trying to keep zebra mussels from getting into Jackson Lake. And so we were inspecting all the boats that came by, and it was, from the training we got, it was just remarkable, because there was, the reason that they spread so quickly, or at least they did back then, well, they don't have any known predators. So, they get into a watershed and they just multiply. And they're, like you said, they're next to impossible to get out.
Right.
But another thing that you said regarding management, that's, I think that more anglers need to be involved in these processes. It seems like, like you said, if you don't have a seat at the table, you're not going to be represented. So I think that's really important. But one thing that you had mentioned earlier was water quality, and I was wondering what ways that is. Are there environmental things that are happening to water quality for bass, or how could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, water quality is obviously you have to have clean waters to support healthy fish populations. And one of the things that certainly in the fishery management world, in state and federal agencies, and it's starting to spill over into the angling world, is the idea that what happens upstream is as or more important than what's happening in the lake. And that watershed management and farming practices and industrial pollution abatement and all of those sorts of things ultimately affect the water quality, which affects the fish populations. And so we have to look outside of the lake, river, or reservoir and figure out who the players are. And again, have a seat at the table when decisions are being made about things like farming practices and things like the Farm Bill, the federal Farm Bill, and trying to support things that will help reduce the nutrient loading, which creates all sorts of algae bloom problems. Excess nutrients can create tremendous problems with the excessive growth of aquatic plants that may be perfectly good plants under normal circumstances, but if you feed them too much, they even native plants can technically become invasive. And so we have to start thinking about what's going on outside of the traditional fishing world and look at some of these other players that are impacting our water quality. Back in 1972, when the Clean Water Act was passed, the public got tired of pollution problems and rivers catching on fire and all sorts of things like that. In fact, Ray Scott, our B.A.S.S founder, was testified a number of times to Congress in support of getting the Clean Water Act passed. Because again, we understand that if we want to have healthy fish populations, we got to have that clean water. So there's a lot of connections there that go beyond the shoreline, so to speak, and thinking more about watershed protection and partnering with organizations that may not be traditional partners for fishing. Get your Bass Club and your Watershed Alliance working together for the betterment of a particular lake or reservoir. So those are the kind of things we're really trying to encourage more anglers, more of our members and our chapters to get engaged with those types of organizations to help on the water quality front. The other thing that really kind of goes hand in hand with water quality is water quantity. And when it comes to big threats, then water quantity, depending on the part of the country you live in, is a huge threat. If you don't have enough water, obviously fish need water. And a lot of folks in the eastern part of the country really don't think about it that much. But if you live out in the West, it is a huge issue. Not just because the water supply that's necessary for the human population, but what happens to the fish in lakes when the lakes are drastically low year after year. And what, then we start getting into those discussions about, okay, who owns the water and who has the right to use it, and who has the ability to say who gets this amount and who gets that amount, those allocations. And there again, we go back to that seat at the table. If the angling and boating community isn't part of or not part of those discussions, then their interests are not going to be considered when those water allocations are made. And I've told any number of my conservation directors, I said, if you're not on the bus, you're going to get run over by it.
Right.
And it's, we really, really need to be vigilant about getting involved. And I know a lot of people they don't like the politics. They want somebody else to do that for them. But unfortunately, that's not always an option, to have somebody that's willing to stand up for the angler interest. And it's getting more and more important for people to get engaged and be advocates for the sport of fishing, and get engaged with those other organizations and those other policymakers to protect the sport that we love.
Yeah, I could not agree more. A friend of mine, Jeff Barger, he says if you're not on, how does he say it? If you don't have a seat at the table, you're on the menu.
Yeah.
And directly related to fisheries management and policy, and a number of other areas. I mean, you gotta show up. So that's thank you for sharing that. And I'm wondering, because I sort of live in this world, Gene, of working with businesses on their different sustainability initiatives. And I have not read anything on this, so maybe it's not researched or there's not information. I'm not sure, but I didn't know if climate change is affecting bass fisheries at all, in terms of warming water temperatures and drought and things like that.
Yeah. It is to some degree, certainly drought issues, but what we see with a lot of climate change are drastic extremes, not just drought, but more floods, more extreme storms, events, and some of that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But on a looking at it on a bigger scale, there is some pretty good data showing that water temperatures in a lot of major lakes and reservoirs and things have increased a little bit. Some states that have really long-term data sets have been able to document the warming of those waters and the longer growing season that has resulted from climate change. And in many cases, what we're seeing right now is an expansion of bass populations, because bass are typically considered, warm water species. So especially in northern states where traditionally have been cool water dominated by things like walleye and trout and salmon and pike and perch and that sort of thing, that as those waters warm a little bit, the bass populations are flourishing, and in some cases at the expense of some of those cool water species. So the state fish and wildlife agencies are struggling now to try to figure out. They have a clientele, they have a customer base, the anglers that are buying fishing licenses for decades have grown up fishing for walleye and perch and pike and those sort of things. And they're getting, those species are getting more difficult to manage because the environment is changing. And the bass populations, whether it's smallmouth or largemouth, tend to be growing and increasing. In southern states, I don't know that we've really seen a lot of drastic changes from the temperature regimes, but certainly things like floods and droughts, that sort of thing, are that may be more frequent, can have impacts on more so on stream and river populations, maybe more so than lakes and reservoirs. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of a mixed bag, but on whole, at least what we've seen so far is that some of the climate change has actually been beneficial to bass fishing, bass populations.
Yeah, I don't know why I didn't connect that dot, but it makes sense. Yeah, they're gonna thrive in warmer water temps, so they'll keep expanding their territory. The warmer the water gets, I guess. Interesting.
Yeah, what we haven't seen is the opposite extreme. When water temperatures get too warm, mm-hmm. What happens to the bass in Florida or Mexico or South Texas or Louisiana or California? If the water temperatures get too warm and stay too warm, will that have some sort of a impact? And the other part of that people have a really hard time wrapping their head around is it may be that climate change is affecting different levels of the food chain that we just don't pay attention to. Mm-hmm. Is the zooplankton or the prey fish, are those communities being impacted more than, say, the top predators? Because what we focus on, obviously, are the bass, the top predators. But what about the plankton that the baby bass eat? Mm. Are there some changes going on there that we really haven't been able to focus in on very much and see what's going on? So I think there's a lot of work to be done to see, what kind of changes we may be having. But the other side of that coin is, well, what can we do about it? Right. And is there anything we can do about it? And, at the scale of, my favorite fishing lake, what can my bass club do? At this point, probably not much. But it seems like, it's a very slow process. And, mm-hmm. and when those things are taking place at such a slow pace, I think people just don't even notice.
Right. Yeah. You start to see some of the effects in different ways, but for bass, they seem pretty well suited for some of these changes. But we just don't know enough about some of these interconnected changes that may play out over time.
Right.
Sounds like. Okay. Well, another thing that I love about bass fishing, and I don't know if this. I don't know the history of catch and release, but I know that mm-hmm. that y'all were a big supporter of catch and release. Can you tell me what role does catch and release practices play in maintaining healthy bass populations?
Okay, well, catch and release was popular among trout anglers for a long, long time. Back in the 30s, 40s, 50s, I guess, it became the norm. And Ray Scott, our founder of B.A.S.S, actually he was on a trip and saw some trout anglers and figured out, wow, they're really taking care of these fish, and he kind of had this brainstorm that said, I bet we could recycle bass just as well if we turned them loose and to be caught again. And so in 1972, he started a program within B.A.S.S, and he called it Don't Kill Your Catch. And that became what we now know as the catch and release paradigm. That it grew to become the norm for among bass anglers to basically turn their fish loose and not harvest very many of them. And from a fish management standpoint, that really caught on in the 80s. Some of the state agencies started putting much more restrictive regulations on fish, on black bass, trying to encourage less harvest. And that in a lot of places that resulted in some pretty big improvements in the quality of the bass fishing. And that has continued today. That catch and release ethic has gotten so strong that whereas 40 years ago or so, about 40% of the black bass that were caught by anglers went home with somebody and were eaten. Today, on a national basis, that's more like 5%. Now, there are certainly places where there's more harvest than that, but on average, the harvest of black bass is almost negligible. And that has, in some cases, caused management problems with overpopulation of black bass. There are some places where that catch and release ethic is very important, where the populations, especially of larger trophy-sized fish, which are much more rare in the population, that's important. But in a lot of places that I call them bass factories, they pump out new year classes of bass year after year. You wind up with more hungry mouths than you have food to support, and you have slow growth, and you wind up with lots of small fish that are not very attractive to the anglers. And part of the problem there is that we aren't harvesting those fish like we used to. And so the whole idea of fishing regulations, in a lot of cases, having a length limit or something on a fish on a lake for bass is pretty irrelevant, because nobody keeps enough fish to really matter. Mm-hmm. And so it's kind of taken that tool out of the toolbox for the fish manager. When you've got a sizable body of water with an excess number of small bass that are growing very slowly, and you don't have people wanting to keep them. So I think in some cases the catch and release pendulum has kind of swung too far to one side, and we need to get it to swing back more towards the middle. In Fisherman Magazine years ago proposed a concept they call selective harvest, which is what we really want to try to support now. It says that there are times when harvest is very important, and there are times when catch and release is important. And you have to know what's best for that particular body of water and be selective about which fish you keep and how many. So that's kind of where we are on the whole catch and release thing. It's become ingrained in bass fishermen that it's almost sacrilegious to kill a bass now or harvest one. And certainly in bass tournaments, the anglers try to do everything they can to keep their fish alive and turn them loose because they want to catch them again.
Yeah.
But that's and we do a lot to try to educate anglers on best handling practices, that sort of thing, to try to make sure that they do, keep those fish as healthy as possible, when they do want to release them.
Yeah, that's interesting. I guess it's in some ways a good problem to have, that you've instilled catch and release to the point that we got a hard, it's like a deer population that's gotten out of control. It's like, all right, we got to harvest some of these to keep them in check.
Right.
Interesting.
And that whole catch and release philosophy has caught on with not just bass anglers, but a lot of other anglers. Even in species that historically have been harvested for food, like crappie and walleye and perch, there's a lot of catch and release goes on, even for those other species.
Interesting. Well, it's in some ways it's good, and until it reaches a point of overpopulation, I guess.
Right.
Interesting. Okay, well, I know, Gene, earlier in the conversation, we talked a little bit, or you touched a little bit on, the importance of habitat for bass, and I didn't know if you had any examples of successful habitat restoration projects you all have supported, or anything along those lines.
Well, fish habitat is kind of a broad term, for one thing, and what anglers can, in a lot of cases, the bass fishing community takes place in reservoirs, man-made reservoirs. Probably 80% of the bass fishing in the country is in reservoirs, and they're getting older. Those reservoirs are aging. And what was great habitat when those reservoirs were first impounded is disintegrating, it's declining. And a lot of the states are now starting to get very involved in projects to restore fish habitat in a lot of those aging reservoirs. Natural lakes generally aren't as much of a problem, that have been there for hundreds or thousands of years. And the habitat is kind of a, natural native plants and that sort of thing. But the reservoir populations is where we really see a lot more focus. And there are grants available that bass clubs and groups can apply for to help with the purchase of, like, artificial fish habitat structures, or things like planting aquatic plants, or for doing things to help improve water quality, and and working in conjunction with a lot of the state fish and wildlife agencies. And there's another organization out there that I work with a lot that's called Friends of Reservoirs, and it's one of many partnerships around the country that work towards improving fish habitat. And Friends of Reservoirs in particular works on man-made reservoirs. And they have federal funding available for big projects. And in some cases, like I mentioned earlier, working in the watershed, not just in the lake, and trying to tackle some of those bigger challenges, because that takes bigger dollars. And some of the Friends of Reservoirs grants are $50,000, $75,000, and then some of that can be matched with state dollars, and you could put together some pretty impressive projects that can really make a difference. Most of the small grants that are $2,000, $3,000, $4,000, $5,000, that a bass club can do, they'll help. But it takes a whole bunch of those kind of projects in the grand scheme of things to make a big difference. But we're seeing all over the country now a lot more emphasis and enthusiasm to doing habitat restoration projects, whether it's, sinking brush piles or putting in artificial fish habitat or trying to get aquatic plants reestablished in lakes and reservoirs. So there's a lot of that going on now. Probably just, I don't know, the last 10 years, it's really, really taken off. And so that's, it gives the anglers a way to get involved and be part of a solution. And I think that enthusiasm really ultimately is going to help pay dividends in improving and maintaining and improving bass fisheries.
And so that was, I think you just answered my next question, which is, I was going to say, how can anglers get more involved? Well, they can, one, get involved with management, and then two, potentially participate in habitat restoration projects where they live. Are there any other ways that anglers might contribute to bass conservation that you can think of?
Yeah, I think the first thing is become educated on what the problems are, and in most places the first connection you really need to make is with the State Fish and Wildlife Agency, with the fisheries managers or whatever lake or river or reservoir that people have an interest in, because they're the ones that really know what the needs are. And in a lot of cases, they may have funding, they may have equipment, but they may not have people. They may not have volunteers. They may need bodies that can help with projects. And so that's the first thing we always suggest is contact your state fish biologist for the lakes that you're interested in working on. And make that connection, get on a first name basis with those people, and you can get a good start that way. Because ultimately we need those partnerships, and working with the biologists, I think is the quickest way to get those connections started. So that's my first recommendation.
Yeah, no, I think that is excellent advice. What, Gene? Well, we've covered some history of B.A.S.S. We've covered some of the threats that bass populations are facing, and we've talked about some ways that anglers can advocate and get engaged. Is there anything else that we missed that you wanted to make sure that we covered on the call today?
I think we've hit the high points. Like we said earlier, then I think you put it well. If you're not don't have a seat at the table, you're on the menu. Right. I like that. It's getting engaged, getting involved doesn't necessarily mean you're going to go to the Capitol and lobby for legislation or get knee deep in politics. There's lots of ways that people can get engaged in the process and be part of solutions to making fishing better. And, that seat at the table is certainly one of them. And from the policy level, that's critical. But but getting engaged with the state fish and wildlife agencies, working with other partners, lake associations, other groups that may have similar interests. I think that's we've got to start reaching out and don't think of us one group as an island. We've got to be part of the bigger community because they're certainly, we know there's strength in numbers, and so I think that's the message we've got to get out there, is that don't sit on the sidelines. Get out there and try to make things better.
No, I love that, and that is wise advice from Eugene, and I appreciate you sharing your wisdom today. But one thing before we wrap, that we are on a fishing podcast, and we've been talking about fishing, and we've been talking about bass, but we haven't talked fishing really for what. So this is a question that I like to try and ask everyone, depending on what they like to fish for. But if you have you are stranded on an island in the middle of a lake, and you have got one lure that is going to save the day. What lure is that? So that we can share some fishing knowledge here on the podcast.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a big one. It's a loaded question.
Yeah, no, and my first thought was, okay, am I in Minnesota or Texas? Where's the island?
Yeah, that's fair.
Some of that sort of thing, but no, if I had to have one single lure, it would be a 1/4 ounce jig head with probably a 4-inch green pumpkin pearl tail grub.
There it is. Write that down. You got it from the Hall of Famer.
I think that's the kind of bait that it's kind of universal. Whether I'm fishing for smallmouth in Minnesota or largemouth in Texas, it'll catch fish almost anywhere.
Love it. I'm gonna write all these down. I'll be able to catch fish anywhere I go before this podcast is all said and done.
There you go.
Well, Gene, I can't thank you enough for your time and for your obvious passion and commitment for our bass fishing and our fisheries, and you're pretty legendary figure in the sport here. So I am thrilled that you were willing to carve some time out to talk to me today. So I just really thank you very much.
Well, I appreciate the invitation, and it's always an opportunity to help, educate anglers. I love to be able to do that. As it was one of my mentors used to say, spread a little knowledge.
All right. Well, thanks for listening to this episode of The Sustainable Angler, and special thanks to Gene for everything that he is doing to protect what we all love. If you enjoyed this episode, an absolutely free way to show your support is by leaving it a 5-star rating and review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It's a chance to tell me what you love about the show, and it helps others discover it too. If you'd like to listen to previous episodes, you can visit thesustainableangler.com. Thanks for listening, and stay tuned for new episodes dropping soon.